"Ma'am, step away from the piano. This is for performers only." The guard's voice cracked across the polished floor of the Vatican's Great Hall, echoing beneath the ancient chandeliers like an unwanted reminder of protocol. His eyes, sharp with training and habit, did not soften as he looked down at the frail woman in front of him, a nun, small in stature, wrapped in an aging habit, her hands trembling not with fear but something more resolute. Sister Maria didn't move. Not yet. She simply looked past him, her gaze locked on the grand piano at the center of the room. It sat like a throne awaiting a monarch, its surface glowing softly under the weight of sacred architecture. Around it, affluent performers in pressed tuxedos and ornate dresses whispered to one another. Who was this old woman? What did she think she was doing? She clutched a wooden rosary in one hand. The other, drifted slightly, involuntarily, as if reaching toward the memory of something she'd once known intimately. The murmur of the crowd grew sharper, slicing into the silence of the sacred hall. But it wasn't just the noise that was rising. It was something deeper. A presence. A sense. Like the moment before a storm breaks open. They didn't know who she was. Not really. They didn't know that once, long before the titles and concerts and the pageantry, Sister Maria had composed a piece of music so hauntingly beautiful it was said to make the wounded forget they were dying. That in a bombed-out chapel during the war, she had played lullabies for orphans hiding under pews. That her melody had once held broken soldiers together when medicine could not. And that night, she was not stepping forward for applause. She was stepping forward for memory. The guard tensed as she took one step toward the piano. One soft, echoing step. His hand twitched toward his earpiece. "You need to leave," he repeated, a little quieter now. "This is not your place." Still, she said nothing. Still, she walked. Behind her, a young assistant muttered something into a walkie-talkie. Cameras repositioned. The orchestra, adjusting their instruments, glanced up, uncertain. Then, unexpectedly, the murmuring stopped. From the far side of the hall, a figure moved into view. His presence needed no introduction. Simple white robes. A face etched with decades of wisdom and sorrow. Pope Francis. He had not been scheduled to attend this portion of the evening. But something had pulled him here. As he approached, the sea of people parted. And Sister Maria, still silent, finally halted. Not in fear. But in reverence. The Pope's eyes found hers. "Let her show you why," he said. The room froze. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim, as if they too were holding their breath. Sister Maria approached the bench. Her fingers hovered above the keys like birds afraid to land. And then, she began to play. The first notes were hesitant, like a whisper stepping into a cathedral. A murmur not meant to be heard, but felt. They trembled on the edge of sound, uncertain and shy, but wrapped in a kind of aching vulnerability that makes even the most hardened hearts pause. No one moved. The conductor, baton frozen midair. The elite musicians, stiff-backed in their chairs, their eyes drawn not to the printed sheet music but to the old woman in faded linen. And the Pope, he did not blink. He sat like stone, yet something behind his expression shifted, softened, cracked. Sister Maria's hands moved slowly, deliberately, her fingers not dancing across the keys like a virtuoso, but searching. Finding. Not the notes. The meaning. What came from the piano was not perfect. There were missed strokes, uneven tempos. But what bloomed inside the sound was unmistakable, truth. And it wasn't just music. It was memory. Somehow, in the trembling chords, people heard things they hadn't remembered in years, a mother's lullaby, a long-ago Sunday morning, the faint cry of a violin in the middle of a war zone. A man in the front row lowered his expensive camera, tears glistening. A woman clutched the crucifix at her neck as if the melody itself had reached into her chest and stirred something buried. The piece she played, unbeknownst to them all, was one she had written herself decades ago. Its name, once forgotten, had been Sanctalo. It had no lyrics. No grand crescendo. It was never played at famous halls. And yet, somehow, the melody had survived. Or perhaps, like she once believed, it had simply waited. Waited for the world to become still enough to hear it again. The song's climax was not thunderous. It was tender. One single sustained note, held longer than seemed possible, floated like incense into the high arches of the basilica. When she lifted her hands from the keys, the silence that followed felt sacred. The crowd didn't erupt in applause. They didn't dare. It was as if they knew this wasn't a performance, it was a benediction. Sister Maria sat still for a moment, her head bowed slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then she turned to the Pope. He stood. And for the first time in living memory, the Holy Father bowed, not to a cardinal, not to a king, but to a nun who had once swept the halls of a convent in obscurity. He placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "What we witnessed was not just music. It was prayer." The crowd exhaled. And someone whispered, "She was the girl who wrote Sanctus, in 1952. Cardinal Vallini, old and rarely moved, stood from the shadows, his voice trembling. "We thought the manuscript was lost, during the Milan bombings." "It wasn't," someone else whispered. "It lived in her." And with that, the hush became thunder, of realization, of reverence, of regret. They called her a relic. A whisper. An old woman who had outlived her purpose. But that night, as news spread like fire across time zones and continents, the world learned otherwise. The Vatican stream, meant to showcase a world-class choir, accidentally caught her entire second performance. Raw. Unedited. Real. By morning, millions had seen it. By noon, they were calling her the nun who played heaven's keys. But by then, Sister Maria was already gone from the spotlight. She had returned to the convent quietly, where roses needed watering and silence was not something feared, but honored. Journalists camped outside the gates. Conservatory directors begged for interviews, begged to publish her compositions, begged to hear the rest of the forgotten symphony. She declined them all. "I have nothing left to say," she told the Mother Superior. "I already said it." But someone else had not forgotten. A man, middle-aged, soft-eyed, hands worn by time, arrived one morning with no camera, no entourage. He wore a plain sweater. He carried a cassette tape. And when Sister Maria was told he was waiting, her shears slipped from her fingers, and her heart caught in her throat. He was the last child from her village. The one she thought had died. He remembered her, not by face, not by name, but by song. "I used to hide behind the broken confessional," he told her softly. "And when the sky fell in fire, your music, it was all I had." He opened his hand. The cassette, cracked and nearly dust, had "Light Song" scribbled on it in a child's handwriting. And next to the words, a faint star. Her symbol. The one she'd drawn for the children she played lullabies for when there was no bread, no power, no parents left. "I became a composer," he said. "Not because I had talent. But because you gave me something worth remembering." He pulled out a thick folder. Inside it, a symphony. Sancta Resurrection, he called it. A lifetime spent building a composition around the memory of her lullaby. But something was missing. "The center," he said. "The original." She knew then what he wanted. Not fame. Not a recording. But a return. Not for the world. Just for them. That afternoon, behind the stained glass windows of the chapel, she opened the piano for the first time in months. She played the lullaby, not with grandeur or perfection, but exactly as she had played it during the war, slowly, softly, like a prayer whispered to a child who had lost everything. And when she finished, he wept. "Now you can finish it," she said, placing her weathered hand over his. And he did. 3 months later, in a modest theater tucked between the narrow canals of Venice, a miracle occurred, not with fanfare, not with celebrity, but with grace. Sancta Resurrection premiered quietly. No press campaign. No headline act. Just a simple flyer pinned to a community board, a symphony of memory. In the front row sat Sister Maria. She did not perform. She did not speak. But when the central theme, her lullaby, returned, not in her fingers but in a swell of strings and a trembling children's choir, she closed her eyes and smiled. It was not pride. It was peace. The audience rose to their feet not with applause, but in silence. Reverence. As if they feared breaking whatever fragile, divine thread had been woven through the music. A journalist asked her afterward how it felt to hear her lullaby as a symphony. She looked at the young woman kindly and said, "It was never mine to keep. True music doesn't belong to us. It passes through." The clip of the performance spread again, not because of advertising, but because people couldn't stop watching. Couldn't stop crying. One child in Syria drew wings on a nun seated at a piano and slipped the drawing under the convent gate. It had one word, mercy. Sister Maria pinned it above her desk. Letters poured in. From survivors, from the grieving, from people who hadn't touched a piano in years but did so now, guided by something deeper than memory, hope. A girl in the Philippines who had lost her grandmother in a tsunami wrote, "Your lullaby reminded me of her heartbeat." A prisoner in Louisiana, "It's the first thing I've felt in 20 years." A mother in Ukraine, "I played your song while my child slept in a bunker. I believe it protected us." She answered every letter by hand. Carefully. Lovingly. With light. To the boy who wants to play piano but has no money, play on a table. On your lap. On air if you must. Music lives in your heart, not your hands. One day, the Vatican sent an archivist. They expected 10, maybe 20 pieces of music. They found 72, scattered on old parchment, grocery receipts, choir rosters. Some incomplete. Some written in symbols only she understood. Some hidden inside scripture. She remembered them all. And when asked if she wanted them published, she said, "Give them to where silence needs healing. Let them live where the world forgets to listen." And that's what happened. Her music went not to palaces, but to places in need. A childbirth in Ethiopia. A funeral in rural Canada. A wedding between two teachers who had survived war. Each piece found its home. And Sister Maria? She remained exactly where she wanted to be. By the garden. By the window. Just, listening. The years passed. Sister Maria's steps slowed, but her eyes remained steady, clear. She no longer played, not even privately. Not out of reluctance, but because she had already said what she needed to say. Through keys. Through silence. Through the ache and healing sewn into every melody. Most afternoons, she sat by the chapel window. The light there was golden, filtered through cracked stained glass. It was quiet, but not empty. The kind of quiet that holds breath. Memory. Grace. When asked if she was still composing, she would smile faintly and whisper, "No. Just remembering." And then, one morning, she didn't come down for prayers. They found her seated at her desk, a candle still burning beside her. Her head rested gently on her folded arms. She looked as if she had simply drifted off, peaceful, still, complete. In her hands was her rosary. But beside her, they found something else. A single sheet of paper. 2 lines of music. Unfinished. No title. No name. Just a soft curve of notes and a faint inscription at the bottom. "You may finish this." When word reached the Vatican, the Pope cancelled all audiences and made his way to the convent in silence. No guards. No announcements. Just the quiet footsteps of a man who had seen kingdoms rise and fall, but had only once seen heaven on earth through a melody. He did not kneel at the altar. He knelt beside her casket. She was not just a servant of God, he said. She was a reminder that God still whispers through those the world overlooks. And far back in the pews, the man she had once comforted with her lullaby as a child now sat as a composer, older, silver-haired, humbled. In his lap was that final sheet of music. He hadn't spoken since seeing it. But his silence was not grief. It was promise. He disappeared for nearly a year. No interviews. No fanfare. Just a piano, a candle, and her last gift to him. He studied her handwritten notes. He read every letter she ever sent. He played that warbled cassette tape from their youth until the faded melody imprinted itself on his soul like scripture. And then, he wrote. Not with ambition. Not with artifice. He listened. To what she had left behind. To what she would have written if she'd had one more day. He called it Sanctu Amen. He did not debut it at a concert hall. He returned to the chapel where she had died. No stage. No audience. Just a single cello, a children's choir, and the piano she once touched with trembling hands. Someone recorded it, accidentally. A nun, standing at the door, phone shaking in her grasp. That video, raw, uneven, with children giggling in the background and wind blowing through the stained glass, went viral in a single day. It reached more people than the Vatican's own broadcast ever had. Not because of fame. Not because of spectacle. Because people could feel it. In that broken, beautiful performance, the world was reminded, not all masterpieces need polish. Some need only truth. And from that truth, a movement was born. It began with a whisper between musicians. A simple idea: what if every country had one night, just one, where the lights dimmed, the noise ceased, and Sister Maria's melody was played? No speeches. No headlines. No politics. Just Sanctalo, echoing into the stillness. They called it the Night of Light. And slowly, quietly, the world said yes. In New York, skyscrapers cut their neon. In Nairobi, families lit candles in alleyways. In Tokyo, crowds gathered in Shibuya Square, not to celebrate, but to reflect. In remote villages in the Andes, a single speaker crackled with a piano tune recorded years earlier by a refugee child. The melody, passed through decades and disasters, flowed across continents like a tide of mercy. There were no fireworks. Only tears. Only memory. A woman in Seoul clutched a candle and whispered the name of her brother, killed in a forgotten war. A blind boy in Kenya tapped the rhythm on his drum, saying, "It makes the night not so scary." In Brazil, a mother cradled her infant and hummed the refrain, lips trembling, voice shaking. It sounds like what I hope heaven is. And everywhere, people stood in silence, not to mourn, but to remember who they were before the noise, before the fear, before the forgetting. The movement spread faster than any trend. Not because of marketing, but because it felt like something the soul had been aching for. And in places where religion was banned, where music was censored, Sanctalo still found its way. A flute in a bunker. A xylophone made from scrap. Fingers tracing keys into the air, into stone walls, into memory. No one owned it. No one profited. It was never hers. That was the secret. That was the power. Sister Maria's music had slipped past borders, past doctrine, past the armor people wore against beauty. It had gone where sermons couldn't. Into prisons. Into shelters. Into war zones. Into the dark, where only a lullaby could reach. And in a small school in Oslo, a teacher built a tactile piano for deaf children. One boy, 10 years old, learned to play Sanctalo using only vibration and memory. When asked what it felt like, he whispered, "Like stars under my fingers." All across the globe, those who once thought themselves too broken to create began composing their own versions. One boy in Johannesburg wrote only 4 notes. He called it My Father's Voice. A girl in Chicago, serving time for a mistake she couldn't undo, wrote Forgiveness in F minor. When she played it, even the guards forgot to breathe. It wasn't about music anymore. It was about truth. And it was spreading. Years passed. Sister Maria's name faded from headlines. No statues were built. No foundations bore her likeness. But her music, her spirit, remained, like a thread of light stitched into the very fabric of human longing. In Vienna, a museum once dedicated only to the great composers, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, opened a quiet room. No velvet rope. No fanfare. Just a wooden bench, a worn rosary, and 2 lines of handwritten music framed behind glass. Above them, in gentle gold letters, read. She played for no one, and so her song belonged to everyone. Visitors came by the millions. Not to gawk, but to feel. Some cried. Others knelt. Most just stood still, breathing in something they didn't know they'd been missing. And in a quiet alcove near the wall, a small video played on loop. Grainy. Shaky. Raw. Sister Maria in Vatican Square. That first night. That first note. That final prayer. Children began learning music differently. Teachers no longer started with scales or speed. They began with silence. With stillness. With story. They spoke of the nun who stopped the world not with power, but with humility. Who healed it not with fame, but with a fragile lullaby. By then, Sanctalo was no longer considered a song. It had become something else. A kind of emotional inheritance. A melody passed not from stage to stage, but from hand to heart, from moment to memory. In a small town in northern Mongolia, a woman sang it through ancient throat singing, claiming she heard it in a dream. She had never left her province. And yet, when her voice trembled on those familiar notes, a girl in Italy, watching a live stream, burst into tears. That girl had grown up in an orphanage where a nun once taught her a lullaby. She'd thought it was made up. But now, she understood, it was a path. And so the song kept moving. In Chile, teenagers painted murals of unnamed pianists with halos not on their heads, but glowing above their hands. In Ireland, villagers gathered in old church ruins and sang the refrain in Gaelic under the stars. And in Rome, every year, on the anniversary of her death, the bells of the Vatican paused. And Sanctalo played. Not with announcement. But with conviction. One night, a blind composer from Canada created a version entirely for touch. It had no sound. Only vibration. Texture. Movement. When asked why, he said, because the song isn't heard with the ears. It's heard with the part of you that's still trying to forgive something. People didn't argue. They just listened. In a refugee camp in Beirut, a boy named Alam played Sanctalo on a broken keyboard. 3 keys didn't work. The pedal was missing. But when he played, the camp grew quiet. Like breath held. Someone recorded it. That clip was later played at a UN peace summit, bringing a room of debating diplomats to silence. The movement had no leader. No name. It was just grace. One evening, the girl from Lisbon, the same who once played barefoot in a blue dress, stood before a global audience and said, "I never met Sister Maria. But I know her hands. I know her silence. I know what it's like to carry music you're afraid to share." She looked out across the sea of cameras and leaders and whispered, "She taught me that your voice doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be honest." The lights dimmed. The piano waited. And when she played Sanctalo again, something extraordinary happened. Across the globe, others joined in, children in shelters, elders in hospitals, monks with bells, DJs with beats. Not rehearsed. Not planned. Just, communion. The world, too loud for too long, had remembered how to listen. And then, another ripple began. A young child, born far after Sister Maria's death, asked his teacher. "Where does the song go when no one's playing it?" The teacher thought for a moment. Then smiled. "It goes where it's needed. Especially when no one's listening." And somewhere, not far, not near, but deep, the melody stirred again. Because some songs are not meant to end. They are meant to return. Sister Maria never asked to be seen, applauded, or remembered. She simply gave what she had, honestly, humbly, and completely. And in doing so, she reminded the world that silence is not emptiness. It is where the soul speaks. Her life is proof that one note, played with truth, can outlast time. If this story touched you, don't let it end here. Share it with someone carrying their own silence. And remember, the world doesn't need another superstar. It needs another Sister Maria. Subscribe to True Echo for more powerful, real-life stories that remind us what it means to be human. Leave a comment, where are you watching from, and what part of this story stayed with you? Let your voice join the echo.